Ready when you are.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Leeds for Europe meeting. Can Brexit be stopped? That's the title of the meeting, but we're not going to focus too much on that. It's going to be quite a wide-ranging discussion, and I'll let the speakers say whatever they want to say about Brexit and how they see it developing from here on in. We've got three very different speakers with very different perspectives on things, and there'll be plenty of opportunity at the end for questions and answers. I've been told it's extremely important, the City Council are absolutely obsessed with this, do not, under any circumstances, fiddle with the microphones. That would be an absolute disaster, so please stay well clear of the microphones. Although, having said that, if you want to use them, they do work, you just mustn't touch them. You pull a little drawer out and there's a button there if you want to use the microphone. Actually, the acoustics in here are pretty good, you might not need to. Just a few words about Leeds for Europe. My name is Richard Wilson. I am the chair of Leeds for Europe. We were formed about a year ago. Once we recovered from the shock of the referendum result, it did take us a while to gather ourselves together. But since then we've been growing as quickly as we can and working as hard as we can to make a movement which is capable of stopping Brexit. But some of you may have heard the latest announcement we have made is that we are planning a major march in Leeds on the 24th of March this year. We are intending it to be the biggest march that Yorkshire has ever seen, certainly the biggest political march, and we want it to be of national significance in getting attention and making people across the country realise that the north of England is not full of pro-Brexit people. We're actually, a lot of us, feel very deeply and very concerned about Brexit, and actually our concern is growing. So please support that in any way you can. Please look into it if you can, look on our website, look on social media, and keep your eyes and ears open for details of that. And if you can do anything to promote the march, around your networks, friends, family, political organisations, please start now. We need to make it as big as we possibly can. So with that said, I'll move on to the meeting and introduce our speakers. Very pleased to welcome three eminent speakers in their fields. We have Denis MacShane, former Labour MP and Minister for Europe. Hard to think of anyone better qualified to speak on this subject, and he's, as you can see here, he's got a book out at the moment called Brexit, No Exit, which you will be welcome to buy before you leave today if you wish. Also, actually, on the subject of things you can buy, this tremendous T-shirt that I'm wearing is for sale in the shop on the way out for £15, and we also have our mugs for £10 if you want to show your credentials to your friends and family and associates and workplaces or whatever. Also, can I just point out that the event is free of charge, but we have to pay for the use of this hall, we have to pay for the promotion and everything that we do, so we need donations from people like you. So please, before you leave, if you're happy with what you've heard or upset about what you've heard, please leave some money to help us continue the fight against Brexit. So the second speaker I'll introduce is Lord Wallace of Saltaire, Liberal Democrat peer and a Privy Councillor and a Professor of International Relations with a long history of various academic and other interests, particularly involving international affairs. And the other speaker on my right, my far right, is Dr. Gregory from the University of Liverpool, a senior lecturer in law and a real specialist in matters surrounding international trade, WTO, and very complex things like that, which I think, to be honest, we all need to get up to speed with. So I'll actually start with Dr. Gregory and welcome him to come and speak. Do you want to swap places?
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for letting me speak here and in this forum. So, I'm used to sitting in such grand seats. As Richard mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in predominantly in world trade law, and really I think one of the sort of, it's very difficult to be junior and very experienced people next to me, sort of what I can offer. And I think it's something that's perhaps slightly narrow, but hopefully is of use, which is really specifically issues on sort of the legal sides of really what the WTO involves and what the WTO is like, because we hear a lot about we'll fall back on WTO rules, or if we don't have an agreement, we'll crash out onto the WTO, and so on, and what that really actually involves. So that's really just the sort of the extent to it. So the WTO, it's a strange one, because as someone who's done trade law for a while, we were in sort of a niche within international law. No one really actually paid that much attention to the WTO in this country until after the referendum, and then suddenly everyone started talking about the WTO. And I think it's useful to just frame what it is and what it isn't, and what it's useful to compare it against. So we often hear about the WTO as kind of like this alternative. It's a bit like the EU, it's got way more members, it doesn't cover stuff as well, etc. And actually it's quite different. So international lawyers, amongst international lawyers, WTO lawyers, we're quite smug, and we always say, oh, WTO is great, it's much better than the UN, it's much better than all of these other bodies, it's really effective. People actually, you can go to court and there's relatively decent compliance and things like that. The problem is that's the point of comparison. The point of comparison is international law, and the actual standard in international law is spectacularly poor. So it's just that it's better than a really bad lot, rather than it's necessarily particularly good. And the EU, as far as trade agreements goes, is really the gold standard. So there isn't a point of comparison globally. That's not a normative statement, that's just descriptive. That's the case. The EU is what most trade agreements would like to be when they grow up. That's the useful way to think about it. So, nonetheless, the WTO does include a lot of obligations, and so let's do the hypothetical. Say we crash out, we have no agreement, something happens. Even if we don't crash out, we have an agreement with the EU, we're still going to be members of the WTO in our own right. Any agreement we have with the EU is still managed by WTO law, and it's challengeable under WTO law, that agreement. And WTO obligations actually extend to quite a lot of things, and they extend to lots of things that hitherto people I think have been sort of associating with the EU, and actually maybe that's not terribly helpful. So the classic examples, ones that get people sort of really noticed, is things to do with food safety. So things like, or related questions, so genetically modified organisms, growth hormones in beef. Currently the one that everyone's talking about lots is chlorine-washed chicken, or chicken that's washed in chlorine-treated water. All of these things are things that you may or may not like the sound of, but there are quite clear rules about how you introduce those sorts of measures. And that's basically what the WTO does. You have a deal which is, if there's science and evidence, then yes, you can stop it. If there's no evidence it's harmful, then no, you can't, and there are some exceptions. Of course, in practice it's much more complicated than that, because science doesn't give us those nice clear-cut answers that we wish we could have. But the difficulty arises in that when you are a member in an organisation and you don't comply with the rules, there are consequences. And the consequences at the WTO are, because it's an international organisation, it's a bit like the playground. So, if you push me, I push you back. That's really what happens. If you don't comply, I'll suspend concessions that I've given you until you do. So that means tariffs on your goods, etc., for a period of time, until you comply. And this is where, for the UK, it's one of those things that we're going to have to adapt to, is that you can weather non-compliance for a period of time if you have a large market. So, for example, the EU doesn't comply with a number of different areas on this area of WTO law. And the US gets annoyed, and Canada gets annoyed, and others get annoyed. The EU can weather non-compliance. It can weather increased tariffs on certain goods. Now, that injures small producers of certain things, but by and large, you're a really big market, that's where your weight comes. Now, as the UK will still be a decent-sized market, but it's not the same thing. The EU really is massively dominant, so our ability to weather those sorts of issues is going to be limited, and we're going to have to be sort of more clever and more nimble. And that's sort of really one of the key differences. We're talking about an organisation where market size is really what determines power in lots of ways, and our market size will be reduced necessarily, and we can still do lots, but the other difficulty is, and we've heard a lot about British leadership at the WTO, which is extremely welcome. I absolutely, wholeheartedly support this. There are areas where we really need the WTO to move forward, But the difficulty is you've got 164 members, and they have to agree. And it's 164 of them, and it's by consensus, not majority. So basically everyone has to agree. That means it's very, very hard for anyone to agree on anything. And we haven't had major agreement at the WTO for a very long time. The current round of negotiations started in 2001. We've had some agreements, but not much. And so it's not like the EU again, because the EU has a driving centre, and it has majority voting, and it has the Commission, and it has different institutions within the EU that can push things forward. And the WTO doesn't really have that. So we have these sort of challenges about how we're going to adapt to being an organisation we kind of might think of a bit like the EU, but isn't really at all. And then we're going to have issues with what it actually covers. So the WTO covers trading goods. Tariffs, lots of that, that's fine. And tariffs across the board actually are relatively low. The problem is, where there are tariffs, they tend to be very high. So we have what's called peaks. So lots of goods tend to have quite low tariffs, but some, it's very high. And agriculture, for example, or automotive, those tend to be areas where it's quite high. So if you're in those industries, like farming, the automotive industry, those things really do matter. But what the WTO is not quite so good at is things like, for example, services, and non-tariff barriers, so things like regulation. And we have rules about regulation and discrimination and so on, so how to make sure that labels don't accidentally discriminate against your goods, but it's not like the EU. The EU has a totally different setup, and we don't have that at the WTO. And on services, equally, we also have rules, but it's a totally different kettle of fish. So at the WTO, you decide what you liberalise, what services you open up. It's an opt-in system. Now, most new trade agreements don't work like that. They have like an opt-out system. But even those where you opt out and you say we're going to open up our services, for example, hotel industry, tourism, whatever it might be, education, healthcare if you want, all of those sorts of things, the difficulty arises with even the opt-out obligations. It's still not terribly, terribly rigorous. And compared to the EU, where we're used to having very easy trade in services, and the UK is a service-based economy. So agreement on services is going to be absolutely critical. And then again, that's something that the WTO doesn't really do. So we're going to have to fix that in our trade agreements. These trade agreements which we have currently through the EU, which we're going to have to find new ways to replicate. The trade agreement that we're going to conclude with the EU, right, after the withdrawal agreement, we need an agreement with the EU. All of those agreements are also subject to WTO law. So you can't just pick and choose, liberalising some things and not others. Right? The rule is it has to be substantially all of the trade, right? Substantial coverage. So that means we can't just say, well, we want it in some things and not others. And in practice, there's been very little litigation on this, because lots of members have dodgy trade agreements that don't do this, so no one wants to raise a claim because they're all probably breaking the rules a little bit, but increasingly they are becoming more comprehensive and you just need one to raise a claim for it to be a challenge. And then we go back to the same problem. If we have a case and we don't win, what will happen? Because it's quite difficult to respond and not comply, which might or might not be a problem depending on what we want the outcome to be. And then just finally the one other thing which I just want to sort of flag up as well. Again, a problem related to the FTAs at the WTO, which is there's a whole area of law called rules of origin, which is desperately technical. Teaching WTO law, you tend not to want to teach rules of origin because you have to sort of sit there and go through it all. But in essence, all it means is if the UK and the EU have an agreement, how do we know if it's a UK good? Because nothing's really made in one country anymore anyway, right? So you have to have rules that say, well, if it's over a certain percentage of value added in this country, then it means it classifies as a UK good. So the problem then is what happens when it's not just between us, and you can see currently in the US they're having big debates about this in NAFTA, because the Americans want to change the rules to basically encourage auto manufacturing in the US with Canada and Mexico. But what happens when you have agreements with other third countries? And so you all have an agreement, so Canada, the EU and the UK all have agreements. You've got to make sure that Canadian goods that come into the UK that are then used to make goods in the UK that then go to the EU, that normally if they went Canada, EU would be fine and have lower tariffs, still get lower tariffs rather than extra ones just because they're not in the same way. And there are technical ways of arranging these sorts of things, but it's accumulation, but it's quite detailed and it's quite complex, and all of those sorts of provisions have to be very carefully thought through, analysed, negotiated and dealt with. And obviously there's a time question as to how quickly we can do a lot of this. But all of those provisions, all of those rules, they're all subject to what goes on at the WTO, both through direct litigation but also the committees. So there's a whole set of bodies where people raise concerns and they do it in a nice, non-threatening way. They say, we'd like some more information. We're interested in X, Y, and Z. And you sort of say, oh, right, could you show us all your evidence to show that you've done the due diligence and you know that this is the case? And so you have to be ready for all of that. And this is an area where we haven't really had expertise in previously. And we're building it up very quickly now, but it's a whole sort of universe of extra things that we're going to have to start learning about. And it's already started, but there's a lot more, and we keep on noticing every few months something else comes out, which is a provision of WTO that people didn't really know about, and suddenly we have to adapt to everything on that. And I think I'll leave it there just as a sort of opening framing of some of the WTO context of some of these things, if you want to have more specific questions. But then I'll just pass over to the speakers. I'm not sure who wants to go next.
Thanks very much, Greg. I'll then straight over to Lord Wallace.
Thanks. I think the title today is, can Brexit be stopped? I think part of the question is, can Brexit be achieved with the time constraints we're now under, and will the negotiations break down? Time constraints, as you know, are now acute. March 2019 is when we have given the commitment, or our government has given the commitment to its party that it will definitely leave the EU, and when the Article 50 time limit runs out. In order to have a neat arrangement, we certainly need to have agreed at least some of the heads of agreement and details by October this year to our specifications. And businesses are saying, actually, since we have to plan ahead, we need to know by the end of March 2018. So time is very, very short. The debate is taking place still at two very different levels. You all understand that the Leave campaign was a wonderful coalition of no's with different preferences. They have still been unable to agree on what sort of Brexit they want. And they have great difficulty, as you would have heard if you were listening to Ian Pacey on Newsnight the other night, in coping with the detail. So we face a situation in which the Cabinet has met twice at length this week and still hasn't achieved any greater clarity on what sort of Brexit it wants. We've just heard from Greg how much technical detail we get into. Technical detail very often carries within it underlying important political and even constitutional issues. The government has just put through the Lords a technical bill, let's say, meaning not terribly difficult, not raising major partisan issues, and lost one vote in the Lords by the largest majority for several years, with the retired Lord Chief Justice acting as teller for the noes, because he believed that this bill was entirely unconstitutional, giving ministers the power to create new criminal offences by statutory order. So that's where, buried underneath the technical detail, you suddenly run into something that counts. And that's going to happen a great deal over the next few months. For people like me, we are now going to be stuck for the next 3 months with the EU withdrawal bill. We had our second reading the other week. When we come back the week after next, we start the first of 10 days in committee, followed by 5 days in court, and a day on third reading, and no doubt after that, quite an extensive period of ping-pong, which is to say disagreement between the two houses. So it'll be May before we finish that. Behind that, there are another 8 bills: customs, trade, fisheries, agriculture, which have to be got through before we leave. The EU withdrawal bill alone is intended to give rise to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 statutory instruments, which also need to be in place very often before March 2019. And some of these, highly technical, are actually quite important. If we're leaving the European Medicines Agency, we'd better have a British Medicines Agency, and somehow that's got to be set up. And the people will need to be recruited and trained. If flights are still going to be available between Britain and the EU, we need some agreement about whether or not we're staying in the European Aviation Agency or leaving the European Aviation Agency and having our own but in close association with it. All of these things at the present moment are down to be done by ministers by statutory instrument. The House of Lords, as you know, is a second chamber. We don't say no in principle to the government, but we do say, on justifiable grounds, ministers aren't allowed to act like this. And if ministers can't tell us what they're going to do when we give them all these powers to make new law by ministerial fiat, then we're not sure we want to give you those powers. So there's a long way to go, and there'll be a lot of detail in this bill. The detail, of course, doesn't hit the wider public. It hits some of the Radio 4 audience, and that's part of the gap between the mass public and those of us inside. Incidentally, on the withdrawal bill, devolution issues are also going to be very important. The Scots, the Irish, if they have a parliament again, and the Welsh. And one of the things I've been negotiating with some of my colleagues in the last week is, what about consultation with the English regions? Because the north of England will lose out from losing European regional funds, but doesn't in any way have a place in the consultative process with the government over how we react to the implications of Brexit. So there are some real North of England issues here. Political debate, the next stage up, I think you're all familiar with, that we have a deeply divided Conservative Party, increasingly bitter. And if you look at the Daily Mail from time to time, the bitterness of this, hatred almost, is there. And in some parts, people begin to talk about a sort of near civil war in terms of the atmosphere of the Daily Mail. Yesterday carried a thing about attacking people who believe in centre ground in politics. Well, if you don't believe in centre ground in politics, it's a bit difficult to have compromise, agreement, and carry the country as a whole with you. But that's, unfortunately, where we are. The Conservative leadership is still arguing over whether it wants a transition agreement or an implementation agreement. And the European Research Group, the organised right-wing group, say it has to be implementation because we have to be very definitely leaving in March 2019. But if you read the middle page of the Financial Times yesterday, you will find that within Whitehall, government officials are also saying that we'd like to be treated for at least a further 2 years as if we were still a member of the European Union, so that we will continue to benefit from all of the 14 free trade agreements that the EU has with the rest of the world. So they've worked out that, jumping off the cliff in 2019 is not absolutely ideal. So there are some real divisions there. It's in some ways cheering that the European Research Group and the Daily Mail and the Telegraph have started to attack experts, the civil service, as well as judges, because, in a sense, that means they think they're losing the argument in detail and on evidence. But it's not good for political debate that we are sinking to that level. The Labour Party, also divided, as you know, the majority of Labour MPs and the majority of Labour members clearly in favour of staying within the customs union and the single market, but the leadership not. Cross-party alliance is developing within Parliament, in both houses and across the two houses. Not quite clear yet how far they will go. Business beginning to speak up, and one of the reasons why business doesn't speak up, in spite of giving people like me and my colleagues fairly horrifying briefings on the impact of dropping out of the single market without our arrangements, but they don't say it in public because, of course, it would affect their share price. You may also have noticed that the Japanese ambassador took the British heads of a number of Japanese firms into number 10 this week to say very bluntly to the government that if they can't make a profit out of exporting from Britain to the European Union, then the future of their investment in this country will be placed in question. So that's another large area. Services industry hasn't yet said very much, but when David Davis talks about a Canada-based agreement, he is actually talking about an agreement which doesn't cover services, which are extremely important to Britain. When he says Canada plus plus plus, he thinks that we can somehow negotiate to have a services element in that, but hasn't again gone into detail on it. Public opinion hasn't shifted very much at all yet. The public at large seem to have switched off. And what some of these focus groups seem to suggest is that for a large number of people, they say, look, the vote was taken 2 years ago, why don't they just get on with it? Why are they still arguing about it? So the detail and the breakdown hasn't yet hit the majority of people. There's little evidence of a major shift. There's slight evidence of people beginning to regret it. The depth of the divide in the public is very clear. Some of you would have seen the recent analysis on how attitudes to immigrants and ethnic diversity correlate so very closely with attitudes to whether we should leave the European Union as fully as we can or whether we should stay. Again, elements of bitterness in the public come out from these focus groups, and that's a real worry for the future of British democracy and the future of British political society. I would say strongly that those of us who want to keep Britain in the European Union have got to take that on. And we've got to look at the problems of the left behind, the people who are on the white working class estates in Leeds, and Bradford, and Liverpool, and Sunderland, or the people living in the coastal towns like Skegness or Wisbech, which had the highest majority of Leave voters. They will actually lose out more if we leave, but they voted Leave because they think they've lost out already from globalisation and from the emphasis on London against the rest of the country, and they voted to say, stop off to the lot of you. And the Daily Mail does a very good job in saying it's this dreadful liberal elites that are doing you down, and we, the public school educated journalists of the Daily Mail, represent the ordinary person. There was a good article in the Times the other day saying, I wonder what would happen to Jacob Rees-Mogg if he went up to Sunderland and started canvassing. It doesn't quite sort of come to terms with them, but I think that all of those of us who believe in staying in the European Union, in all parties and none, have got to start talking about how we invest in the education, the local regeneration, the social housing that we've neglected over the past 20 years through successive governments, let's be honest about it, in order to begin to shift the atmosphere and shift that part of our political public. Let me give you just one example of this. We're just about to introduce a new national apprenticeship system. For the last year, people like me have been hearing that it's going to be a disaster. And it is not going to help people from poor areas at the age of 18 to get basic training and basic skills. And I hope you all understand that part of what's been going on for the last 20 years or more has been that companies, building companies, hotels, whatever, have often found it much easier and cheaper to recruit directly from Eastern Europe people who are skilled, highly motivated, whatever, rather than invest in training their own. So it's absolutely vital that we do spend more effort and money on training our own. If the apprenticeship scheme is a failure, those who voted leave in such large numbers in those white working class areas will feel even more embittered and neglected than they were. So, are there any game changers? Difficult to see at the present moment. If the multinational companies begin to become more open in their threats to leave, that will begin to make a difference. Of course, if one of them were actually to say, well, we're going to close down the factory, that would make a huge difference, but I suspect none of them will. The economic downturn which we're facing is not hard enough to make a real impact on the public. You know, we're only growing at 1%, slower than Greece, but that hasn't yet really hit people very hard. If the Labour leadership were to shift on the single market and the customs union, that would certainly make a major difference. And if there were to be a more open split within the Conservative Party, or a breakdown of the government's position altogether, we would perhaps then find ourselves in a very different situation. But behind it all, as Michel Barnier says from time to time, the clock is ticking, and the government keeps kicking these very important decisions further forward. So that, in a sense, one of the things that might rescue British membership of the European Union is that the government hits the deadline and doesn't know what to do and can't actually arrange to leave in March 2019, even if some of its members want to. Thank you.
Okay, I'd now like to invite our final speaker, Denis MacShane, to speak.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's great to be with a very dear friend, William Wallace, and to hear the techie points that, not techie, that Greg was making. I loved all that stuff about rules of origin. I'm sorry, you can't hear me, sir? Okay. I'm terrified of touching this microphone in case it goes bonkers. Good, you can hear me. Excellent. Well, I thought it was absolutely fascinating to hear all about the rules of origin. And I want to see the study that tells us quite clearly what the rules of origin of Donald Trump are. Because I think we need to know exactly where he came from. And I'm also very worried about genetically modified organisms arriving in Britain. I think the one we've got, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is probably enough to be going on to begin with. But we are in an extraordinary moment. It's the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And you read any of the great historians' accounts of how it started, and nobody can actually explain it. Nobody ever intended that 4-year-long tragedy to get underway. But a decision was taken, and another decision, and then another, and then suddenly it was unstoppable for 4 years. Now, I'm not comparing Brexit to the First World War. I think Brexit will last a lot longer. I don't think it would cost, well, to God, it doesn't cost as many lives. Though, by the way, we are pulling out of having any geopolitical influence over European foreign policy, security, the development of any policy concerning military action. That is the first time in 500 years of British history when we have, as a nation, English history perhaps to begin with, sought to send men, blood to die, treasure, money to bribe, to persuade, to extort, to pressure people into ensuring that continental Europe was first of all open to our goods, our commerce, open to the free passage of our people, and wouldn't pose a threat. And it really is 400 years of blood and treasure, as it's called. And then suddenly, by some miracle about 50, 60 years ago, that long era of European warfare came to an end. as men rose above, and women, the old nationalist divisions and put them not completely to one side, France remains France, Germany and Poland remains Poland and all the rest of it, but park them. And I find it astonishing that we are walking out of that arrangement just on those grounds alone. It's also absolutely extraordinary for me to think that this is the first time in British political history, in the sense of the modern parliamentary or democratic era, place, sit, start where you like, cutting off King Charles I's head, or the Glorious Revolution, or whatever, votes for women, which we're celebrating this week. But it's the first time when we are actively saying to our citizens, you will have fewer rights. You will be less endowed in your rights as British citizens. You will lose the right, I'm thinking of my 4 children, 23, 24 to 30, 31 this year, who will not have the right, as I've had, many of us have had, to live, to work, to try to retire in Europe without let or hindrance. Yes, of course, we've always been able to live and buy a house in Europe, and whenever the royal family was in trouble, you could always get another king from somewhere in Europe to keep the bloodline going. But we're actually taking these rights away from people. If you think about it, the history of democratic politics is always to extend a right, and now we're reducing rights. And yesterday's news, William, I don't know if you saw it, the government saying leaving Europe will mean that you can reform, i.e. reduce the existing level of trade union rights. I'm speaking as a lifelong trade unionist, that British workers enjoy. And if you think a Tory majority government's going to replace those rights with stronger ones, then your name isn't Arthur Scargill. So this is actually a very, very weird moment in British history. I always saw it. I wrote this book, published in January 2015, called Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe. 6 months before the general, 5 months before the general election, when David Cameron then committed himself to a referendum. And I argued over, I did 250 pages, why, from all of my political experience, my work in Europe, every referendum on Europe this century in the continent of Europe has been lost. If it came to a plebiscite, we would lose. And I couldn't find anyone who would believe me. I mean, I went from conference to conference, I went from professor to professor, I went from minister to minister, Labour opposition leader, shadow cabinet person, and so on. On the day of the referendum itself, a dear friend, Anand Menon, who runs, you must know him, William, the King's College London European Institute. He's very entrepreneurial, he's a wonderful guy, very energetic. And I said to him, Anand, what's the result going to be today? Dennis, I know the English. They'll bottle it. They haven't got the guts to vote out of Europe. And Peter Kellner, again a very dear friend, the Liberal left chief pollster, chairman of YouGov, bumped into him. It'll be 55-45. Andrew Cooper, now Lord Cooper, David Cameron's personal pollster, 56-44. I just couldn't believe that any of these idiots had ever knocked on a door in their life in the last 40 years outside of Notting Hill Gate or Richmond or wherever these people live, and actually seen what people say on the doorstep. And well before it was a question of European Union citizens, it was Kosovars, and before that it was Indians. Oh, I'm sorry, I was MP in South Yorkshire, Pakis, that horrible word, Pakistans. Before that it was Afro-Caribbeans, and before that I was in Portsmouth at a meeting like this a couple of weeks ago, and a lady stood up and said, in Southampton in the 1950s, the notices on the boarding houses were, no coloureds, no Irish, dogs welcome. And that's just in there. Enoch Powell brought it all up to the forefront, and then it subsided. It was actually suppressed quite strongly, but from 1997 onwards, there was a demand, incessant demand for a referendum in Europe. William Hague, I have to say, other people, Tony Blair, Paddy Ashdown, the referendum was the kind of holy grail of democratic consultation. Ladies and gentlemen, it isn't. As Clement Attlee said, and then Margaret Thatcher quoted him, referendums and plebiscites are the devices of demagogues and dictators. It was the first Napoleon who introduced them, then his grandson, that idiot introduced them, Hitler did them, they did them in Vienna. Plebiscites had all power to the press, and I wish to God our political class of my generation had just stuck with what's called parliamentary representative democracy. And all three parties, my own leader, Tony Blair, William Hague, Paddy, Charlie, Nick Clegg, all of them were obsessed with having referendums. And then you started the whole power-light stuff about the arrival of European Union citizens here. Who is the biggest employer of EU citizens in the United Kingdom? The National Health Service. Why? Because we've never trained enough doctors and nurses ourselves. Why? I don't know. I mean, we abolished a proper craft apprenticeships in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher. Good luck with bringing any of them back to life now. The bosses won't pay for them, the government will never enforce them, and we will again be short of skilled technicians, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, all the things I can't do, but you need to have done in a society that needs them properly paid. So why didn't we? Why didn't we build enough social housing? Between 1997 and 2009, my government, my party, I was a minister for 98 years, we sold 495,000 council houses. In Yorkshire and the Humber, we built 24. Is there any understanding that a man, perhaps who's lost his job as a steel worker or in the 1980s in the coal mines, and he sees his daughter, his son, without a job, without a proper house, without a decent income, he takes his grandchild to the reception class and he hears lots of foreign languages. It's always a bit strange and disturbing. It's a problem in all countries. There are up to 1 million Brits who live permanently or part-time in Spain. And at last count, 8 of them spoke Spanish. And you go into a Spanish supermarket and you can hear them all with the trolleys bellowing down to their husband or their wives left at home on what they should order. And so when that happened to us, and it was a Bulgarian in Tesco's in Rotherham pushing a trolley and bellowing down the phone, or a Slovakian, I could see my friends, retired miners, looking at the cheap offers with their tin basket, looking perturbed. I understand that completely. But the answer was to address their concerns, not to scapegoat the people who came and did jobs. Now, the politics has always trumped the economics. It did in 2016. I then wrote this book published in the middle of last year called Brexit or Exit, Why in the End Britain Won't Leave Europe. Its core thesis is, very happy to buy it here or in Waterstones. I'll be coming back to Waterstones Leeds in next month to do a debate. But the core thesis was simply that British capitalism would not allow British politics to, as it were, enroll Britain in the economic version of a Dignitas clinic in Zurich and commit economic suicide before our eyes. You have the Japanese ambassador in a most extraordinary intervention. I've worked with the Japanese colleagues for many years as an international trade union official. They say nothing. They're utterly quiet and discreet. There he was on the doorstep of Downing Street saying, we're off. If you're off from the single market, we're off out of Britain. He dressed it up and said, oh, we'll have to leave, we can't make money. Nissan exports 57% of what it produces in Sunderland to the EU. If we are out of the single market, it'll be very hard to export. There are 1 million components coming to the British aviation that's making wings for Airbus, other components, satellites, anything that flies and goes up into the air. Big British industry. 1 million components come into the UK every year, free of customs checks, free of the rules of origin checks that Greg was talking about, and they would all need then to be checked. Have you ever tried to send an envelope with a book or anything, a magazine, I mean it's a packet, not a letter or a card, to Switzerland or Andorra? I've got family in Switzerland, my daughter's teaching English in Andorra at the moment. You have to fill in a little customs form. You must have done it for other countries, you know, a little white thing, we put how much it is, what it weighs and so on. Fine, imagine doing that 1 trillion times every month for everything coming in and out of the UK. That's a bureaucracy we're proposing to create. But I'm wrong. it seems that British capitalism is going to bow down before British politics. And as William rightly and precisely said, it's an open civil war in the Conservative Party. It must have been like this in the 1640s and 50s. It must have been like this over the Corn Laws, free trade in the first period after the Napoleonic Wars. I guess it must have been like this on the Irish question. Disraeli got up in the House of Commons in 1844 and said, we have, as part of our kingdom, an island occupied by people who do not own their land, who are poor, who do not share our religion, do not acknowledge our monarch. That, Mr. Speaker, is the Irish question. 1844. It took until 1922 before it was partly solved. And I would argue it took until 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, helped before by John Majors, not just a Labour or Tony Blair thing, before it was sort of 90% solved. And now the Brexit people are wanting to tear that whole thing up on the issue of the whether or not we stay in the customs union. We won't win any new markets if we're outside the customs union. Germany, in the first 11 months of last year, exported 1.8 trillion euros worth of goods. I don't know how many zeros that is. It's about half the total size of the British economy. We lie 15th in the league table of exporters per head within the EU. See, you don't have to be outside the customs union to win markets. You actually have to have products and goods that can sell and have a trade minister who's a bit bigger than Liam Fox that people like. You don't have to leave the customs union to achieve any of that. So that open civil war in the Conservative Party now is devouring it. And it may well be they can't come to any decision. No use firing Mrs May, because it would be a double plus civil war over whoever was elected in her place if she was to be pushed out, and so it would carry on and on. No chance of getting much reaction out of the Labour Party. The Labour Party, as in the 1950s and 1980s, is just out of play. I mean, I disagree. I think we could be stronger and clearer. I believe if there was a John Smith or a Harold Wilson or even a Tony Blair speaking for the Labour Party, he would find the words that would trip up Mrs May a bit more. But Jeremy Corbyn is who he is, and Labour are genuinely frightened. I've spoken to friends up here who are Labour MPs, of being seen to repudiate, as it were, the vote of their electorate. Leeds voted, I think, 50 points something against 49 points something for Remain. Hooray, well done, Leeds. But if you're an MP and you want to remain, you're just a bit nervous. We have no leadership at the top. We have guys, when they speak, I agree with and write, I agree with everything they say and write down, like Tony Blair and Nick Clegg. I'm a big fan of both. As a Labour MP in South Yorkshire, I urge people in Sheffield Hallam to vote for Nick in 2005. But they are yesterday's men. They carry baggage. Blair with Iraq, Nick with every young person I know from my 4 children who were students in his era, over the students' fees things. I'm not getting into condemnations, don't misunderstand me. And it is sad that there's no new voices that are emerging on this. There's no effective organisation. There's not enough money. I mean, sorry, Richard, thank you for doing this, but it's ridiculous you've got to pass the hat round to hire this room. And you think of the money that Rupert Murdoch and the people who own the Daily Telegraph and Lord Rothermere have poured into anti-Brexit campaigning. It's heroic that there's over 100 of us here when England are playing rugby this afternoon. So we don't have enough organisation. I'm not sure William is... I've been making something similar by way of a speech, on and off for 18 months. I'm still waiting. This is no condemnation of your heroic efforts, the heroic efforts of many, many of our friends. But it's not yet come to light, has it? It's not set, the prairie is not yet ablaze. And I'm not sure it will be in sufficient time. It's getting uglier and uglier. I don't know if you saw the front page of the Daily Telegraph Thursday, It looked as if they brought in as guest editor the ultra-nationalist, populist, xenophobic Prime Minister of Hungary called Viktor Orban. And he's running huge attacks against George Soros, who's a Hungarian now American who made his billions, and then actually the Eurosceptics loved him because he more or less forced Britain out of the exchange rate mechanism, and that stopped dead any possibility of Britain entering the euro. But now they're attacking him because he's a giant charitable foundation that promotes good causes, freedom of speech, rule of law, women's rights, anti-xenophobic campaigns. It's not very left-wing, for Christ's sake, if he's a billionaire speculator, he's not a socialist. But the Hungarians don't like him, and they portrayed him, they found the ugliest pictures, which many people in Hungary consider to be openly anti-Semitic. And on Thursday, the Daily Telegraph front paged him the same ugly pictures because he's giving a bit of money to an outfit called Best for Britain. He also, in the same tranche of donations, gave money to a Tory think tank called Bright Blue, so he's not anti-Tory. But they presented him as a subversive, ugly foreigner who's coming in, about to subvert British democracy, and he'd overthrown other governments, and he was secretive and all the rest of it. I mean, it really was back to the 1930s in terms of the Brexit journalism we're facing. So, ladies and gentlemen, what will happen? There's a number of friends who are pushing hard for what they call a new or a second referendum. In fact, I think it would be the fourth. I mean, the first referendum was 1975. The second consultation was 1983, because older colleagues, people of my age here, will recall the Labour Party committed itself to withdrawing from the European community in its manifesto in 1983. And there's a wonderful picture of Tony Blair, young, got some dark hair, standing for the first time in Sedgefield, and beside it the quote, "Vote Labour and I promise to take you out of Europe." We have a lot of Lords, Adonis, Mandelson, Mark Malloch-Brown, a friend, all pitching for this referendum. I say the second one was in 1983, the third one was 2016, so this will be the fourth one. I am nervous of putting all our eggs in a new referendum basket at this stage when public opinion hasn't shifted. I think that when people vote in a big way, they move to voting for Mrs. Thatcher or Tony Blair or an American Donald Trump or in France Emmanuel Macron, or they vote in the referendum, that's a bit like getting divorced or moving house. You may think after a year or two, oh God, why did I dump him or her? Oh God, why am I living in this plate glass, aluminium, city centre flat? Actually, the semi in the suburbs was very much nicer. But you can't go back. And it takes time after a big vote, I think, for people not so much to rethink it, but for the vote to become history, something in the past. And that's not yet happened. It may not happen, I think, for a year or two. Certainly, I very much doubt if it will happen in time to stop March 29th coming. And I don't think, anything is possible, that the Conservative Party will be ready to suspend, delay, prolong the Article 50 negotiations, because that would imply taking part in the European Parliament elections of May 2019. And that would bring back to life UKIP. And if there's one thing that everybody in mainstream politics is breathing happily about, it is the disappearance of Nigel Farage. Sacrifices have to be made. So it's going to go on some time. My guess is we will leave the European Union politically. No more commissioner, no more MEPs, no more attendance in the Council of Ministers. That actually is a massive loss of influence for Britain. We won't be sitting in with any of our colleagues, the Prime Minister, with the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, the Chancellor of Exchequer with Finance Ministers, the Foreign Secretary with Foreign Ministers, the Transport Secretary with his or her equivalents, deciding what Europe does. We will become rule takers, not rule makers. And it's extraordinary self-abnegation for a great, important, populated, reasonably well-run liberal market democracy like Britain. But I think we will be there. That can will be kicked down the road. I think the transition period will probably give way to another transition period. I mean, here I'm sucking my thumb. Or it could get so bad, much will turn much sour than I was thinking for in this book. I'm writing a new book, trying to work out what's going to happen. I want to try and talk to the 52% rather than just condemn them. All the focus groups we do show that although there's a lot of apprehension, anxiety, people are aware of some of the economic consequences now. They don't like to be told they were deceived, they were gulled, they were wrong, because that means you have to admit you were stupid if you made that mistake. So we've got to find a new discourse for the 52%. I'm not sure we're really able to do that at this stage. And above all, get out of London. Too much of the anti-Brexit campaign is just salons, dinners, parties in London of one sort or another. My own favourite proposition is to do constituency audits on Brexit, to do at the level of Barnsley or Bradford. Maybe Leeds is too big, it needs to be chunks of Leeds, Redcar, Wakefield. A precise, it's not rocket science work, it's not hard work, account of the social, political, above all business consequences on the exporting industry, foreign direct investment, on the agricultural, horticultural industry, on tourism, travel agency, which sell an awful lot of retirement homes and flats in Europe, which may now have to dwindle away. Obviously on direct healthcare, on the old age care homes, on delivery, on road haulage, on transport, and produce in each, and really at the constituency level, businesses, people you know, the hospital you know, the university you know, and just produce almost like a little brochure of 8 or 12 pages and get it into every home. It doesn't cost an awful lot. It takes a bit of work, not a huge amount of work. Really get the story down to the Redcar or the Rotherham or the Rotherhide level rather than giant national picture. Too many of the national stories are too confused. I read them obsessively every day, but it's like being in a kaleidoscope. There's too many little different pieces of information. There's no concrete theme. There's no dominant story that everybody can agree around. Don't blame the journalists. It's hard to decide what to focus on. The guys who know what they want, the pro-Brexit, the anti-European proprietors, their journalists, the Telegraph, the Mail, the Sun, the Express, bits of the Times, sometimes actually quite a lot of comment pieces in the Guardian, very sadly. They are obsessively fighting that campaign. We haven't got a strong enough voice against it at the moment. I'm sorry I can't bring you news of enormous cheer, except that we end with my old friend, fellow Hill Walker, David Davis. In the quote that's engraved on my heart, David said in 2009, "A democracy that cannot change its mind ceases to be a democracy." So just hang on to that. Let's find ways of changing our minds, changing the minds of friends, of colleagues, of family, and see if we can create enough space. Because Mrs May, believe me, and Jeremy Corbyn, they're both saying, if you're prepared to go there against Brexit, believe me, I'll lead you. But I'm not moving until you're ready to go yourself. So let's see what we can do to change a bit more of public opinion, step by step, meeting by meeting, argument by argument, event by event, as Richard and the wonderful Leeds for Europe people are doing. So, I'm very, very confident. I'm looking forward to a new film. I saw, anybody has seen The Darkest Hour yet? Yeah, Dunkirk. I mean, it's absolutely full of historical howlers. Remember The Darkest Hour, they have Clement Attlee ranting at Neville Chamberlain. Speech never happened. Churchill meeting a black guy on the tube. The idea of Churchill taking the tube. It's a 3-minute walk from Downing Street to Parliament. And then he exchanges verses from Macaulay with this nice young black guy. I especially love Dunkirk. You remember the bit where the Spitfire lands on the water in the channel very softly. There's a big fight to get the pilot out. Spitfire engine weighed 3 tons, the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine. If it landed in the water, it would have been down in less than 1 second. There are lots and lots, but the film we want to make, the next film I'm proposing to Hollywood, is Churchill who coined the phrase a United States of Europe. It was Churchill who said we can resolutely diminish national sovereignty. It's Churchill who proposed a Council of Europe. I mean, if you're a real student of Churchill, he from 1944 onwards was more and more in favour of European integration. So let's wait and ask Hollywood next year to make a film called Churchill the European. Maybe that will change a few minds for us. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much for the speakers. I'll just say, in answer to Denis's point, we very much take on board that the opinion needs to change, and we don't talk about the second referendum. We are in the business, Leeds for Europe, and going out there and engaging with the public, and we talk to Remainers, and we recruit them to our cause, and we talk to Leavers. Some of them, there's no point talking to them, but there are some that it is worth talking to, and they're the ones we're trying to bring across to our side, and at that point, once we've done that, then we have a chance of actually reviewing the decision. But I think it's fair to say that time is really short, and that's why we're intensifying our efforts. That's why we're doing the march next month, and everything we're doing is in recognition that we've really got to get on with this if we're going to salvage the situation. So we need everybody on board as quickly as possible. Anyway, I'll open it up to questions now. I'll take them in threes, and then we will come into the panel. So I'll start with this gentleman here.
Very little was said by the presenters about the Irish question, except that there is an Irish question. The European Union have made it clear that the only way to prevent a hard border in the island of Ireland is for Ulster to remain in the single market. Now, if this is accepted, of course, where does the DUP stand in its relationship with the Conservative Party, propping up the Conservative Parliament? And it seems to me that the Irish question is the Achilles heel on many of this. Aside from services and manufacturing, the constitutional issue of Ireland. It was an issue in the 19th century, and it's a big issue now.
Okay, take another question.
Oh yes, I've got three. I'll try and make them very briefly. Could the Lords have done anything more? And is the limitation by time on the executive? Does that really throttle the power of the Lords to do their job of scrutinising legislation? Basically, I've been told, and I'm frightened to death of this, universal credit is rolled out despite the fact it doesn't work in October. Will people blame the European Union for that? And yes, back to the question of the Irish question. Doesn't full regulatory alignment with the customs union and single market forever and ever mean in effect that hard Brexit isn't a possible deal? And how real is a no deal? How real is the possibility of the government walking out, as the Brexiteers claim?
Okay, one more at this point. Into the back.
Given the consequences of leaving Europe, it is a very simple question. Given the consequences of leaving Europe, why couldn't the designers of the referendum ensure a large platform between the people who voted to leave and the people who want to remain? Why did they want a particular percentage of the perhaps 20% margins, very marginal to me? And I'm representing York for Europe right now.
Okay, who wants to go first?
I'll go first since the Lord was asked. The Lord's is going to get lots of flack from the right wing in the next month or for obvious reasons, this will be difficult. We've produced a huge number of reports on aspects of Brexit already, which the government is struggling with, and it gets. The problem is we have to deal with the detail, and the detail doesn't get through very much to most people. It doesn't. When it came to the summer after we dropped out of the European Union, when lots and lots of British tourists flying from Leeds, Blackpool, or wherever else, had spent 45 minutes in the queue for customs.
Yeah.
Then it would begin to get through to people, but nothing like that's happened yet. So, meantime, with the Second Chamber, we have to go on saying, can you justify this? Can you make sense of that? Just to give you a couple of things that hasn't yet been mentioned, there was a very large set of issues about internal security. The government said nothing about how we will continue to cooperate with other police forces, intelligence agencies across Europe on counter-terrorism, counter-organised crime, the lot. When the Conservative government was arguing for opting out of a large chunk of all this, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, insisted on opting back in to a whole host of things because they were necessary to Britain security. So that's an issue that hasn't yet come up. Denis has mentioned the whole question of foreign policy cooperation and defence cooperation. Mrs. May is making a speech in Munich the week after next, in which she's going to set out how the British government thinks it's going to continue to cooperate with others. And then we will be engaged in that discussion properly. Boris Johnson has said he's going to make his own speech on the subject 2 days beforehand. So the sparks may possibly hit whatever they hit in these cases. On the Irish question, yes, it is a fundamental. Some of us, particularly my wife who's here, 2 years before was saying it's a fundamental issue you can't ignore. A lot of those on the Brexit side are still determinedly ignoring it. And that's linked to the attitude that says, oh, we managed perfectly well before 1973, didn't we? Why can't we go back to where we were before 1973? Which I've heard Conservative MPs say. The answer obviously is, you can't. The world's changed, and the relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland has changed, thank goodness, enormously since 1973, when we had a substantial chunk of the British Army engaged in holding down the conflict in Northern Ireland. Lastly, why no threshold for referendum? Huge tragedy. Conservative government thought it was all going to be so easy, David Cameron's charm would get them through, that you didn't need to take such a precaution. Huge mistake.
Would that normally be done with a referendum to have a minimum
Threshold.
is that normally the way referenda
I don't think referendums are normal yet, thank goodness.
Well, I think it's true to say in other countries it would be wrong, but we don't have enough experience of running them, that's the problem, isn't it? Sorry, the other two panel members need to come back on that.
In the 1970s, we had referendums on Scottish and Welsh devolution, and you had to get 40% of all those eligible to vote to support them. Only 37% of the electorate voted for Brexit. So it's a norm in other countries. Hungary it's 50%, Switzerland it's majority of the people and the cantons. It varies from country to country. I agree with you, 1.9 million young people, 18 to 24-year-old, were kept off the electoral register or were not on it because of changes the Conservative Party brought in to try and reduce their participation. They said it was to stop fraud, but the real reason was they assumed young people would vote a bit more left or liberal than right. I'm not sure that's true, but 1.9 million eligible 18 to 24-year-olds didn't vote. 2 million of our fellow citizens, or up to 2 million, the figures aren't clear, in Europe, didn't vote, a French or American citizen carries his vote or her vote wherever he or she goes. We just strip people of the right to vote. In the Scottish referendum, 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote. I mean, the insouciance, the carelessness of Mr. Cameron after he decided to have the referendum in not trying at least to ensure that everybody could vote, people whose future would be decided. An awful lot of old people, and I'm not young, voted for leave, but you know, they'll soon be dead. I know they say in the Vatican, while there's death, there's hope, but I don't think we should over-rely on that to get a change in public opinion. But a lot of young people who should have been allowed to vote will be affected, would not. On Ireland, I couldn't agree more. I'm back in Cork. I go to Ireland as often as I can. The Irish are tearing their hair out. There's a breakaway IRA organisation called Sheroid, which means liberation, is divided into dissenters and dissidents. Don't ask me what the difference is, but one group's prepared to return to the armed struggle. And for 80 years after 1922, the great pleasure of any rebellious, angry Irish nationalist was to go and have 6 pints of Guinness, find a soft bit of peat and take a pot shot at a British border post. They will come back. The Chief Constable of Ireland has said it is unavoidable that there will be return to serious tension, possibly violence, if those border posts return. But you can't be in one country being in a customs union and the other not, and not have border posts. I mean, a lot of cars can be waved through. I lived 100 metres from the French-Swiss border for a number of years. A lot of cars were waved through, but lorries and vans were checked. There are 11-man staffed, border posts on the 27 main roads across from Sweden in the EU customs union into Norway, which isn't. Again, they're not all checked, but some are. But in our case, I was with Michel Barnier 10 months ago. He said he instructed or he told the French government they had to set up major customs control, sort of almost factories, checkpoints on all the borders, all the ports in France into which a British ship, ferry boat, Eurostar, container ship can arrive. But that's just the norm. It's going to mess up. Well, not going to mess up. It's just going to change, bring in huge amounts of bureaucracy, paperwork, potentially a real pain in the butt if, like me, you take your car once or twice a year across to France. But maybe we just have to get used to it. Price worth paying, the Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson will tell us. But the price that's not worth paying is putting in any way at risk the Good Friday Agreement. That's 140 separate agreements, solemnly agreed between London and Dublin, and all anchored in EU legislation and procedures. As I say, the Irish Friends have been tearing their hair out, but until it's on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and it's seen as a matter of urgency, nothing will happen. Just as in the past, frankly, some of the oppression and loss of civic rights for the Catholic population in the 6 counties was ignored until it turned to violence. And as William said, we have 400,000 British soldiers stationed at one time or another in 6 counties in Northern Ireland. 3,000 people killed, many maimed and wounded. Terrorist bomb attacks here. I'm not saying it's going to go back to that, but even the tiny, tiny risk that it might should give pause for thought. I'm afraid for many Conservatives, they just don't give a damn. Frankly, anything that, again, I think puts the thumbs down on Ireland, some people in this country, particularly in political persuasion or unionists, aren't necessarily unhappy with.
Yeah, just quickly on the Irish issue. I mean, as a sort of relatively technical thing, but so occasionally you hear sort of like, well, we've got agreement that there'll be. So regulatory alignment is not a technical term. It doesn't mean anything. That's just, you know, it's a very useful construction, but it doesn't actually mean anything legally speaking. And what there's an agreement that there won't be a problem. It's not quite the same thing as an agreement. It's just, it'll be fine. And there are a few problems with that. So one of the hopes, so you have to have, if you don't want any border at all for goods, for example, and agriculture and sort of that's food is one of the key issues. If you don't have it, fine, but you've got to have it somewhere if we're not going to have the same regulatory system. So then that means in the IRC rather than on the border of the north. Obviously there's political issues, which I won't get into with all of that, but even with such a system, what you then have is a part of the UK where a different regulatory system applies. So it would only work if basically in the north it means that the EU's rules on a whole range of things are applicable. The difficulty with that is, and this is something that I don't have an answer for because I'm still writing the paper, when it's done I'll let Richard know and then things might be a little bit clearer, is so there are areas, particularly on food for example, so I mentioned beforehand beef hormones, so growth, hormone treated beef, which the EU doesn't like because there's concerns that it might be carcinogenic. There's actually not mountains of scientific evidence, so it's a bit of a problem, and this has been litigated at the WTO and the EU lost. The EU has taken the decision, which is basically, we don't care, we're not complying. We care enough about this that we're just not going to back down.
All the beef that Donald Trump's eaten is hormone stuff.
Well, and lots of, and what we even go to the US and all these sorts of things. And in fact, so we've kind of negotiated settlements around this, so we give preferential access to non-hormone treated beef from Canada, for example, under the new agreement, all these sorts of things. The question is, when the UK leaves, if we maintain that ban, and we don't have those sorts of products, well, we're not complying. And we're not the EU to weather those sanctions, right? So what do we do when a bit of the UK is still with the ban? Say we say in England, Wales and Scotland, oh no, that's fine, we're okay. Turns out beef hormone is fine. Well, but what happens, because Northern Ireland still isn't, so what happens if we get taken to dispute settlement because they say, well, you're still not complying because in Northern Ireland doesn't apply. International law does not care for the excuse. Well, it's not me, it's because they don't care. International law thinks of you as a prince. Right? You have total control over your territory, you are responsible for everything that happens in it. So I don't know how that is going to be resolved. Even if you were to have that situation which the DUP would find unacceptable, I don't know how you would resolve that. There might be a way around it. And one of the classic ones that keeps on coming out is technology. Technology will fix all of this. Who knows? Maybe it will do, and that would be wonderful, and that would be lovely. There isn't any realistic evidence that that's actually possible right now. It might be in 10 years' time, we might be in a different situation, but right now, in a year and a bit's time, that's not an option. At least it doesn't seem to. And if it is, it would be nice to have a clearer idea of how it is, but that's just sort of one of the things that keeps on coming up.
Okay, we'll for 3 more questions from that.
I think it was Harold Wilson that said a week is a long time in politics, or is alleged to have said it, and the election of Donald Trump demonstrates that the inconceivable can happen, but as a way of motivating us, and it may be a difficult question to answer, what politically, not economically, what politically is the worst case scenario of this situation?
Okay, another one? Yes.
Is there still a fake hope that we could launch a party, a new party, like in France, occupying the centre right and bringing together people addressing the right questions in this country?
Okay, that's a question of a new party, such as En Marche or France. Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, but the question, in your individual opinions, what are the most credible arguments for Brexit that we need to address and put to the Brexiteers?
Okay, wants to go first?
Most credible arguments are sovereignty, taking back control, and we simply have to, it's not easy, because that's very powerful and very persuasive. And underneath it, as someone said to me in a book shopping in Grassington last summer, damn it, we beat the Germans in both world wars, didn't we? Now they're trying to tell us what to do, and that's a gut thing, isn't it? You can't actually have complete sovereignty unless you're an empire. And when the British Empire had sovereignty, it was at the expense of the Irish, the Indians, and an awful lot of other people. Now we do much better to share it and to say with them, who are our friends? Who have been But who are the other countries we really share values with? Liam Fox believes that China is a free trading country that we ought to be closer to than Germany. No, and then Russia and Saudi Arabia. No, is that really what we think we should be doing? So play around on that. It actually, in terms of British values, who do we share them with? Well, the Brexit right says with the Anglo-Saxons, but actually we share it with European democracies as much as anything else, and that's what the EU represents in actually a rather nasty and illiberal world now. So that's the sort of arguments I would make. Rapidly on the others, what are the events we have to look forward to? Conservatives are scared that they'll lose heavily in the local elections this year. So do your best to make sure that comes true. If they do badly, in London they think they'll do particularly badly. But if they do badly elsewhere as well, that will shake a lot of the right-wing Brexiteers. So that's one immediate thing to go at. Then I think, in terms of what may give you hope, I really do think they're running out of time to take the decisions which will allow us to exit by March 2019. And although Jacob Rees-Mogg and Bernard Jenkins and some of the others on the right think it'd be wonderful to just drop out then, there are enough people in the cabinet who think that would be totally horrifying. So at some point there will be a crunch then. In terms of points where we can have hope, that's it. In terms of what you lot should be doing, you should be bullying your MPs as well as you can. You should be writing to your newspapers and on social media. Every time I look at the Yorkshire Post letters column, I think, gosh, there's some funny people around. So you've filled it up as well. And you should be pointing out to your friends, colleagues, cousins and others that what the government's getting away with at the present moment is using deliberately vague language to avoid taking decisions. What does a bespoke agreement with the European Union mean? Someone said to me, a bespoke suit is one that's just a bit different than the one on the peg and costs you twice as much. What is a deep and special relationship with the European Union? It's something we'd quite like to have, and we haven't quite defined it yet, so please can we have it, Mrs. May would like the other side to define it. What is regulatory alignment? As Greg said, it actually doesn't mean a thing, but it sounds good. And it's somewhere between regulatory diversity and regulatory alignment. We can somehow avoid facing up to the hard choices on the Irish border. Actually, we can't.
Okay, I agree with everything that William said, particularly the very strong point about voting in the municipal elections, which I don't think applies to Leeds, William. I don't think the metropolitan boroughs. It's London and unitary boroughs, so it won't be the big cities like this. But sorry. Oh, Leeds City Council. I'm terribly sorry. I'm sorry?
The entire council is up this year.
Oh, I'm awfully sorry. Somebody told me that the Mets weren't voting, so I'm just a bit out of touch. Okay, good. Well, I think the strongest possible non-Tory vote would give a salutary shock. It would be big in London. The former people, Kensington, who lost her seat in last June, a woman called Victoria Hoyt, said they thought Kensington might go. The Wandsworth, which is the flagship darling council in London, people are worried there. Even in Westminster, where I live, there's some hope. Well, that would send a very, very clear shock and might persuade Jeremy and John MacDonald and Keir Starmer to have the courage of London Labour voters, if it's Labour that does particularly well. So yes. Crisis, fundamental crisis, sir, your point. Yes, a defeat in the House of Commons, obviously, but a defeat can be ridden over. I don't see, and I ask every Labour and Tory MP I meet, do you think there's any chance of a complete collapse and then a loss of vote of confidence for the Prime Minister? They shake their head. Do any chance of an election before, well, it doesn't have to go all the way to 2022. It does legally because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Mrs May got out of that last year. But any chance of an earlier general election? No, we heard that again this morning. John McDonnell was caught by Nick Robinson. He wanted to talk about renationalising water companies, and then he was asked about single customs union, single market, and he was lost on a sort of how many times can you say a single market and the single market, a customs union and the single market. So how many times you can make a and the dance on the head of a pig? I mean, it was slightly kind of unreal. But if Labour was to come out quite clearly, that might break the logjam. Labour shouldn't be worried. UKIP got 1.8% of the vote last June. 1.8%. 64% of all Labour voters are Remainers. You're never going to get Tory voters and hardcore UKIP, Tory and BNP voters to vote. You just don't worry yourself about them too much. I think Labour should be much more confident on making the economic case for staying in the customs union and the single market. But don't forget, we can still leave the EU without having resolved any of these questions. We can unsign the treaty in March, well, technically it has to happen by October, but it's formally adopted by March 29th next year. We're no longer members of the European Union Treaty, so we don't, as I said, elect MEPs, send the Commissioners, send ministers to the Council of Ministers. We will be out of the treaty politically, but we can keep kicking transition cans down the road, say that we're going to have to keep negotiating. The EU will be happy with that. Maybe it could go from transition to transition to transition. I mean, right now, Brexit is like an Ebola virus, isn't it? Sucking the life juices out of British politics and parties and the government, where everybody's pajamas. Labour is, Tories are, Libs are, Scots and that's are. Nobody can discuss normal politics. That is unhealthy, so perhaps we'll just get tired with it. We live in this weird limbo. Pour vous, monsieur, malheureusement, on n'a pas d'élection pour le président au dosage de proportionnel. Just say to our French friend, we don't elect a president. That allows a sudden surge, Trump or Macron, and we don't have any kind of proportional election system. So I'm afraid the British majoritarian first-past-the-post system, in my judgment, will probably not permit the emergence of this wonderful, shining, ET, AI, sort of central, centrist, all things to all men party. There's a great American Democrat called Jim Hightower from Texas said, you know, there's only two things in the middle of the road. That's double yellow lines and dead hedgehogs. So this is hope for a middle-of-the-road party. We may have to wait a while.
Okay. Anyone want to ask one more question, or should we wrap up? Okay, that's about it then. I mean, I just will. Okay, one more.
The northeast of England is having a very hard time, and therefore probably voted out. If we are to convince them to stay in, what are the practicalities and what's the evidence that we're going to use?
Okay, just quickly.
Well, very simply, the North East has benefited hugely from foreign direct investment. And the foreign direct investors are all saying, they're not saying it out loud, they're not saying it on the front pages, because as William said, they don't want to upset shareholders, they don't want to upset their overseas bosses, they don't want to upset their employees and managers, which I completely understand. But they are saying, we lose access to that market of £450 million. There's no sense staying here. This has got a wonderful production line in Barcelona, much as Slovakia, it's just like Detroit. It's just a giant new, highly modern, highly skilled automobile assembly line and components manufacturing centre. So that's the argument that needs to be got across, as you mentioned the Japanese ambassador. But you've got to do it up there. You can't do it with a speech in the House of Commons, a quick half second when Nick Robinson or John Humphreys allows you to make a pro-European point. It's got to be local people doing it with some help. This is a lack of organisation, a lack of money. You mentioned Leeds, York for Europe. I'm very happy to come and talk. In the university towns there are people like you and you, but Redcar, other places, they just aren't quite so ready. The MPs have some resources, not enough. I wish Labour and MEPs would use their last 2 years to campaign a bit more about that. But until you actually go and talk, the way Mrs. Thatcher did it when she broke the miners' strike, it just wasn't articles in the Sun or the Daily Mail or Telegraph. She sent agents to knock on doors at tea time, 5, 6 o'clock in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. She ignored South Yorkshire, she ignored the Yorkshire NUM, that was uncrackable. She found the softer areas and she went and talked to them, not herself, and said, "Are you sure this is right for your family? You're not going to win. The British state isn't going to give in to Arthur Scarborough one way or another. Start coming back to work, you'll be looked after and protected, we promise you." Some did, enough did. It took away some of the strength of the overall dispute. So we have to do, almost like a meeting like this in Sunderland, say, or in Middlesbrough, or in Redcar, Consett, twice a week for the next 6 months. But who's got the resources and the organisation to put it together?
Quickly, I'm not sure, not as a campaign, I don't really know how you would use this in any useful way because it's somewhat of a negative message, but there are a lot of things that people are hoping that, and particularly in sort of post-industrial towns, that were hoping that withdrawal from the EU would allow them to do. So, for example, with all the issues with Port Talbot, because we can't defend against this cheap Chinese steel, the WTO rules insist on that. And you can't because there's WTO rules that tell you you can't. And so you can do sometimes, but not other times. And it's actually, that's not the EU's fault, that's the system that we have. Similarly, subsidies. So we say, oh, well, but no state aid rules will be able to do whatever we want. The problem is, you can't. Because if you get it wrong, and when you have statements coming out saying we're going to give specific support to specific industries in specific regions, specificity for a trade lawyer is a big, giant, red flashing light, because it means it's a potential subsidy. And if there is a subsidy, it means that those goods can then be subject to extra tariffs, where they go to other countries. So all of those sorts of things, we don't really have that much freedom in being able to do all of those things. So it's not really any better. Which is why I say it's not necessarily a positive message to take, but that is a responsibility of why that won't change massively.
Greg, so if I may, Richard, I think you made a very important point, so I didn't ask the questions fully, and that's absolutely right. We need to get brochures out there saying, outside the EU, there's no guarantee the steel jobs, the coal mining jobs, or whatever come back. We need to look at, we haven't discussed this at all, freedom of movement, all the Europeans coming in. There are many ways we can skin that cat without leaving the EU. It doesn't apply to state employment. The biggest employer, as I said, of EU citizens is the state in this country. We have many EU directives that slow it down. There are emergency breaks. It's only if you've got a job. It doesn't apply to welfare payments. It doesn't give you automatic free access to the NHS. Not that many of them take that because they're all quite young at the moment. The problem will be rather people of my age and older in Spain. When I was a minister, we brought in the European registration scheme for European workers. Mrs. May abolished it. We could have ID cards like in other countries. We don't actually know who the Europeans are living in this country. As you can't move in Belgium or Germany or the Netherlands without telling the police or somebody where you're living. There are many different ways. We could have proper manpower, regional manpower planning procedure. We could bring back compulsory craft apprentices so that you would know, employers would know, that they'd have each year X thousand people graduating from proper apprenticeship schemes able to do electricity, plumbing, computer stuff and carpentry, construction in a skilled way. So they wouldn't be importing Irish or Polish or whatever skilled crafts were. unfortunately, the trade unions aren't taking that up. I don't think there are very active trade unionists here, but the trade unions, I think, can be much more proactive in talking to their own members about what one can do to manage the internal labour market, not to stop. You can't stop anything. There are 300 million Ukrainians in Poland. We've always had an open border to 1 million Irish since the 1950s. You can't stop people coming in to do the low-paid work, digging up leaks from a Lincolnshire field at 4 o'clock in the morning, doing the healthcare work, lifting people on and off looms, very poorly. That's not done by local people. That's why we brought in the Windrush people, we brought in people from India and Pakistan. We've always, as a country, relied on people coming in from other countries. And there's 1.5 million Poles in Germany. The percentage of Poles in this country is 1.7% of the population. In Ireland, it's 4%. But you can read all the Irish press, listen to all the Irish politicians, and plenty of robust, loudmouth politicians in Ireland. None of them attack the Poles. That's a speciality of Nigel Farage and the Tory MPs, and some Labour ones too. I'm really not making a big political point. The Daily Mail in 2008 produced, according to the Federation of Poles of Great Britain, you can look it up, 50 hate front pages against Poles. Polish killer, Polish rapist, Polish fraud, Polish thief, Polish assailant, Polish. And so of course people think, Christ, let these bastards in, they're killing, raping and all the rest of it. Obviously they weren't white London taxi drivers, but we can't attack white London taxi drivers because they're British.
Just very rapidly, evidence jumps better when it comes from the region. And actually you need people inside the North East to talk about that, as simply as we need people inside Yorkshire to say what we will lose from it. But I think otherwise, we've all got to recognise that the values are the biggest one we've got to win as well. And saying to people, do you think Britain should be really closer to China than it should be to France? Do you really think that Trump's America offers a better vision for Britain than working with the Dutch or the Swedes? It's that sort of thing we've got to get at. Do you think British values are fundamentally different from Norwegian or Danish or Dutch? Because that's part of the gut stuff that we have to get over, particularly with the older generation. And to say to them, we can't go on fighting the Second World War. Yes, we can, have nothing to do with it. Just to remind them, to support Dennis, that the largest contingent of pilots in the Battle of Britain after the British were the Polish.
Okay, I'd like to finish by thanking very much the panel, our three speakers. Very interesting. Thank you all for coming. I would like to just conclude by answering our own question, can Brexit be stopped? Well, it can, but we have to work very hard to do that, all of us here. We need to join the movement, we need to donate, we need to persuade our friends, family, colleagues, people on the street. We need to lobby our MPs and Lords and anybody in a position of power to actually do something about this. And finally, please join us on the 24th of March in Leeds to march and demonstrate that we do not want to go ahead with Brexit. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, see you later.